All right, welcome back to Chapter 4, Part 2. This is a little less busy and less congested as the first part, and it has some review. So this chapter, we're finishing up this chapter. We're talking about, again, making carbohydrates available. So this is the whole digestion that we were just talking about in Part 1. So enzymes are in the mouth, we were just saying. They are also in the small intestine because they're released from the pancreas, and there's also enzymes in the small intestine that help to digest these starches. The first one is salivary amylase. So we talked about amylose being like a chain of beads. That's basically each bead is a glucose, and that is what amylase can do. It can break the bond between each saccharide so that it becomes a monosaccharide, or it can take a long chain and break it into disaccharides. This is started right in your mouth, so you may not break down the monosaccharides in the mouth, but at least to shorter saccharides. It's not there that long, but it's just enough to get it started. One thing that can help too is cooking. So the difference between a cooked carrot and a raw carrot, a lot of that boiling and cooking and whatever you do breaks down some of the bonds, so it's a little easier for digestion. But once it's moving down your system, down your esophagus, the amylose then can start digesting in the mouth, but as amylase is also released by the pancreas. So once the starch is in the small intestine, another injection or another amount of amylase is released and it's broken down once again. This maltase, which you can guess is the enzyme for maltose, is available actually not from the pancreas, but it's on the enterocytes or the absorptive cells right in the small intestine, right where the maltose is going to be present. So that maltase can break maltose into the two glucose molecules. And the same thing with sucrase. That's the enzyme. ACE always emphasizes or signifies an enzyme that acts on sucrose, which is the glucose fructose combination. So it breaks it down to those two monosaccharides. And that also is in the cell of the small intestine or near the cells. Where in the same with lactase, this acts on lactose to break it to glucose and galactose. So these last three enzymes, not amylase, but maltase, sucrase, and lactase are all enzymes in the small intestine, whereas amylase is actually from the pancreas and from the pancreatic duct moves into the small intestine to work on the carbohydrate. So glucose and galactose then, usually as we mentioned, require a carrier to get into the liver, so it takes energy for them to be stored, whereas fructose is diffused just from without any energy, moves right across the cell membranes. So there's the difference in absorption. And back to digestion, we mentioned about the amylase in the mouth and the amylase in the small intestine, but there is no digestion in the stomach because of the low pH. So that not much happens there, it just passes through the stomach. And then in the small intestine, again, we mentioned the amylase and these three enzymes. So here's the breakdown. The amylases convert the polysaccharides to disaccharides. And there's the salivary amylase from the mouth and the pancreatic amylase released later from the pancreas. And then disaccharides, they're broken down into these monosaccharides from maltase, lactase, sucrase, and there's actually another trilase. So those are all present right in the small intestine. So that's pretty much the breakdown. It's quite simple. It seems quite simple. So it can quickly get into the bloodstream and give us the energy where we need it. However, fiber, again, because of its complexity, really does not get digested, at least the insoluble, until the large intestine where the bacteria can actually work on those very complex fibers and break them down into what we call short chain fatty acids. So it actually turns into fatty acids, which becomes an energy source for the large intestine, and it also protects the colon from bacteria. This is healthy to keep other things away. So that's one important benefit of fiber. Another one is that it can reduce cholesterol and heart disease. So while the soluble fibers are working their way through the digestive system, and we mentioned that they help slow things down so we don't have a high blood sugar trigger, that they contain cholesterol, which is a type of lipid, and this bile acid or bile salts combine with the soluble fibers, and it takes care of some of the cholesterol, actually takes some of the cholesterol out of the system, releases it in the bowels. So it's kind of a filter. So the bile salts, along with the soluble fibers, can help reduce our cholesterol level. So that's another good reason why we need to have soluble fibers as well as insoluble. If you have a low fiber diet, the association is that it can cause hemorrhoids, which I think we might have mentioned in chapter 3, which is swelling of the veins in the anal region. And you can lose a lot of blood. It can cause constipation, which then can cause hemorrhoids, and there's a lot of bleeding and a lot of pain. So without enough fiber, we can have that problem, or we can be caught. It can form what's called diverticula, which are little pouches along the colon. So if you remember, the colon, large intestine, has generally smooth, but this is a diseased colon that has these little pouches all along it. Now, if these get infected, if something gets inside one of these pouches, it can become diverticulitis, which means you have infection, inflammation, and then people have to have portions of their colon removed if the infection can't be treated, and if the diverticulitis is that serious. So another good reason to include all kinds of fiber in your diet. It also can prevent colon cancer. You can imagine if the colon doesn't, having food sitting long time, constipation's not occurring, then there's less chance for cancer cells to grow. So there's a review check. What about putting carbohydrates to work? So now we've talked about how important it is to have carbohydrates. Our brain needs it, our body uses it all the time. But what is the right amount of carbohydrate? So the main reason we need it is because all the tissues of our body use glucose, our brain, our red blood cells. And if we don't use glucose, then we can use ketone bodies. You've probably heard of ketogenic diet. The ketone bodies are similar in a way to glucose. They're produced from fat, but they are readily available sources of energy too. So in general, we would like to use fat and carbs for protein and not, for energy and not protein. So that's called the protein sparing effect of carbohydrate. You want to use protein for building tissues, not for energy as much as possible. So if we don't have enough carbohydrates, then we'll either use protein or fat. And as long as it's not, as long as you have no carbohydrates, a small amount of carbohydrates, okay. But we can have what's called ketosis, which isn't necessarily that bad, as long as we're getting enough fats to give us the energy and we're not going into malnutrition or starvation mode. So here is the blood glucose is regulated, as we mentioned in chapter 2, I think, by different hormones. If you have too much blood glucose and your body isn't taking it out of the blood and putting it in the liver, it's called hyperglycemia, and this would be your blood levels. Or if you have too low blood glucose and you're not getting the right hormones to regulate it, it's called hypoglycemia, and you can feel as you sort of like you do when you're not, haven't eaten for a long time. You can have a shaking, you can have lightheadedness, weakness. So we really want to have this homeostasis in our glucose and our blood glucose. So insulin, as we mentioned, and glucagon are the two hormones that are essential. Insulin is going to increase the movement of blood glucose into the cells, and glucagon is going to increase the glucose release from the liver and even the muscles, just to get our blood glucose back up. This is you don't need to memorize these words, but if you study these, you can see all these words are different words that describe where the glucose is going and where it's being stored. So for instance, ketogenesis means you're converting lipids to ketones for energy because you haven't had there's not enough storage of glycogen, there's not enough food being ingested, so you go ahead and use the fats. So that's just, you can look at those words. And then insulin, as we mentioned, takes the blood glucose and stores it in the liver, and it forms it as glycogen or even as fat. Lipogenesis means making fat because you have plenty of glucose, and then it forms adipose tissue or fat cells as storage. So blood glucose control is regulated by the liver and the pancreas because the hormones are released from the pancreas to regulate this. So those are one of the really serious cases you might hear about, ketoacidosis. This would only happen if you had diabetes but were not taking any insulin. In this case, acidosis means you're getting ketones and acid. So what happens is you're breaking down fats because you aren't able to, your insulin is not working, so the blood glucose is high, the blood glucose is high, but it's staying in your blood because you don't have any insulin to move it out of the blood. So now you've got a high blood glucose and you're breaking down fats to make ketones. The combination could be deadly. And this usually only happens for diabetics that are not being treated with insulin. So when you are trying to be careful not to have too many simple sugars, you can try to follow a low glycemic diet, which means they've taken foods and sort of looked at which ones make your blood glucose go highest and which ones don't. So here you can see basmati rice, vegetables, lentils, pasta, whole grain bread. They do the least amount of spiking of your blood glucose after eating. So anybody that's watching to prevent hyperglycemia might want to eat low glycemic foods. And there's a list of those in this. So fiber then, we already talked about, reduces cholesterol. It can reduce obesity because you feel fuller sooner, so you're not going to eat as much because you just can't, you're full. Carbohydrate needs, like how much do we need every day? How much fiber do we need to be like regulated? So the minimum we need is 130 grams, but that's just the minimum. Most of us get 300 to 400 grams a day, or 300, I guess. And then if you think about the percentage, 45 to 65% of your total calories is usually carbs. So you'll do that in your 3-day recall to see what your percentage is. And then how much fiber we need, the recommendation, again, it's just an adequate intake. We don't know exactly, but about 25 grams a day for women, 38 for men. These are 18 and over. And the averages are quite low compared to what is recommended. So this is a big push from the dietary guidelines, is trying to add more fiber, add more soluble fiber. And one of the problems with not getting enough, besides the diverticulitis and the constipation and the hemorrhoids, we want to also be sure that we keep our waistline, by having a larger than normal waistline is one of these aspects of the metabolic syndrome, which there's 5 contributing factors that can lead to a potential of heart problems and diabetes later on. So these are things for prevention, to try to prevent from having abdominal obesity, keep our blood triglycerides and cholesterol lower, try to prevent high blood pressure, and do this by having physical activity, eating more fiber and less simple sugars. So because of type 1 diabetes, of course this we think is an autoimmune disease, is not really affected by what we eat, but the type 2 diabetes is very common. I think 1 in 3 adults is pre-diabetic. In other words, they're very close to becoming a type 2 diabetic. So we can prevent this domino effect by trying to increase the fiber and activity. So those are the main points in this completion of chapter 4. Okay, thank you.